So my name is Jason File. I'm the mythology teacher. This is the second time I've taught it online. I've taught it a couple, maybe once or twice before that on ground. Once, I think. So it's still a new class for me, and I'm teaching it in a way that is pretty different from how it's traditionally taught. The subject of mythology traditionally is taught culture by culture, so that you look at like Near Eastern mythology, and then Egyptian mythology, and then Greek mythology, and then Roman, and then Viking, and so you just kind of go through the cultures and talk about their mythologies. And that's the way the course has been set up traditionally for a long, long time. The problem with that is that it tends to focus mostly on Western mythologies. And the world is bigger than just the West. And I wanted to teach this class in a way that opened it up to non-Western mythologies, the mythologies of China and Japan and Aborigines and Native Americans and the Aztec, and just the Slavic and the mythologies all over the world. And you can't really do that in a course that goes culture by culture, right? I mean, it's just, there's too many cultures. So I thought we would organize it by topic, this class. And there are topics that all mythologies from all over the world deal with. And so I felt like that would be a better, more open way of approaching it. So for the first half of the class, we're talking about the physical world, the natural world, the sun and the moon and the stars and the rivers and mountains and caves and everything in it. And all cultures have stories about those things. So that's what we'll focus on. The first half of the course will be what I call the given world, the world that that we're born into, the physical realm within which we're born, we grow up, and then we die. And that's the focus of the first half of the class. The focus for the second half of the class is the individual psychological experience of growing up. Because again, all cultures have these stories called the hero myths that kind of trace the process through which one goes from being a kind of infantile, egocentric, self-absorbed being, and through a process of adventure and trial and tribulation and defeat, eventually attains a state of emotional or spiritual maturity. And this has been outlined by Joseph Campbell and others in a book called The Hero's Journey. And so that's what we'll focus on in the second half of the class, is the process by which we become better versions of ourselves, as seen through the mythologies of the world that deal with this process. And again, all cultures in the world have something to say about this. So I've restructured the class so that rather than go culture by culture, we'll go topic by topic. And within that, we'll have access to myths and traditions from all over the world. Now, obviously, there is no way that we can even begin to scratch the surface of the sum total of the mythical traditions on these topics. So we just select. I pick things to talk about. You'll pick things to talk about, and we'll leave a whole lot out. I read on the discussion boards earlier today, I think it was Alexis, talking about Maori people. Was that you, Alexis? Yeah. So the Maori are native New Zealanders, and she found a myth there that she really liked, and she said that she was getting interested in Maori mythology. Well, if that's the case, you can do your discussion posts on Maori mythology, or some of them, or you can just learn about the Maori on your own. Whatever you're interested in is fair game. Every week you'll be doing discussions with your group, and you'll be asked to find a myth on a particular topic. and you just Google it. I don't know how you find it. Just find it however you want. You can look on YouTube or Google or anything else. The idea is that you hear the story and then you put it in your own words. You don't cut and paste it from a different source, but you sort of kind of read the story and learn it and then retell it. Pretty briefly too. I mean, you don't want to go on for 18 pages telling every grainy detail of the story. I mean, maybe you do, but most times people don't. So just find a story that connects to the topic for the week and throw it on there and be sort of brief about it, and then see what your classmates say in those groups. And you'll also have podcasts to listen to. Some of you may not be familiar with podcasts, but again, Google is your friend. Just Google podcast mythology, and there are a number of them. And they're just, it's audio recordings of people talking about various myths. And there's lots and lots of mythology podcasts. So just find a podcast that's on a topic that you like and listen to it and write up a review of it. I'll probably vary the assignments a little bit. So some weeks you'll have podcasts, some weeks you might have something else. We'll see how it goes. Last semester was the first time I taught this online. I have a lot of lecture material that we'll never get to touch because, there's just not enough classroom time. So I'm constantly finding, new material online, and finding assignments and changing things around. So this is very, very much a class that's still in the construction creation phase of it. It should be a pretty easy class. A lot of the stuff we're going to do is credit, no credit, because I don't feel confident enough in telling you, this is what I want you to know, and then, quizzing you on it, because I actually don't know what I want you to know. So I'll just throw a bunch of stuff in front of you and say, what do you feel? And you think like, well, I feel good. And say, well, that's fine. So this class should not be a problem for anybody to get an A in. It should be a pretty easy A. Do the book reports on time, do the discussion boards every week. A lot of the other stuff will be pretty simple. You'll have quizzes here and there, but you should do your best, but they're probably not going to dent your final grade too much, even if you bomb it. All right. Questions or comments? Dustin, how are you doing?
Pretty good. How about yourself?
I'm pretty good. What are you thinking of the class so far?
I like it.
So it seem okay?
Yeah.
Yeah. Alexis, what about you? I know. Alexis is, I should make you a TA, Alexis. You know me well enough by now after all these years.
I would love it.
I know, I would too. Alexis went on a trip to the Holy Land, to Palestine. She brought me back some dirt from the Mount of Temptation where Jesus was tempted by the devil. And I've got it in my office, and it reminds me how to handle my temptations in my own life. So yeah. How does the class look to you? It's going to be different, right, than the other ones. Yeah. Have you started reading the Ramayana yet?
Not yet. I was thinking today, I was like, I feel like I need to read something, but I don't know what it is, but it's the book for this class.
You got a little bit of time. So Chloe, how are you doing?
I'm doing great. I'm really enjoying the class so far.
Okay.
I got to listen to a lot of different podcasts. I didn't just pick one, so I think
Good.
it's been nice. Good.
So I hope you all know, and I'll say it again, that this class is it's in construction. It's under construction. I expect that there will be a lot of things that just don't work or are confusing or whatever. I'm relying on you to tell me so that I can either change the assignment, make it better, or adapt as we go. I would ask all of you not to be passive recipients of this information, but rather active participants in it. And if you don't like something or don't understand something or don't agree with something or do like something or whatever, engage and tell me. I won't take it personally. I won't, I will value all the feedback, constructive and critical. So please don't imagine that this is a fully formed curriculum that I've taught 100,000 times and I know what I'm doing. I don't know what I'm doing. I'm doing the best I can, I'll tell you that. But beyond that, I got nothing. Fortunately, actually, that's not true. It's not. I don't have nothing. I have my friend Sam Shaw, who's not in this class, but rather decides to volunteer. Yeah, decides to volunteer his time on when we have these to show up and talk about whatever we're talking about. Sam was in one of my classes about 10 years ago, probably now. Oh my gosh.
Yeah, 10 years ago.
Yeah, and I'm gonna blow some smoke up your butt a little bit,
No.
but is one of the most interesting people that I've ever met. Reads voraciously every subject under the sun, knows about tons and tons of things, including mythology, has a very interesting personal life story that includes growing up in the foster care system and then serving with the US Marines in Iraq, and returning home and dealing with what do you call it when a rocket ship re-entry?
Yeah.
Dealing with the re-entry process into civil society again, and got married a couple years ago and just had his first child. Oh gosh.
September 30th.
September 30th. So he's a brand new papa.
Yeah, it was the only good thing about that year was my child.
Yeah. Yeah. So I am very, very pleased that Sam has offered to come sit in on these classes and share some of the things he knows about mythology with you. Yeah, I mean, it's just kind of a dream come true for me to be able to have you here, Sam, and be able to talk about some of this stuff with you. And I can tell the students there's just very few people you will ever meet in your life as interesting or as bright or as insightful as Sam. So we are very lucky that he decides to show up. And
no pressure.
Everybody, no pressure. Yeah, I know.
It'll be great.
Yeah. So everybody be nice to him so that he comes back next week. So, all right. So this week we're talking about the sun and the stars as our first kind of lecture topic. And you all can stay on with your video camera on if you'd like. That helps me, or you can go off it too if you don't want to. I fully am. Dustin is gone. Dustin had his
I'm camera shy, okay?
I know. I don't begrudge you that. That's not a problem. I do like to get visual impressions of people. I feel like that is helpful, but making people stay on their video camera the whole time is just, seems like needlessly torturing things. If you're comfortable leaving it on, that's fine. If you don't want to, that's fine too. It's really no problem. If you want to go on and off and in and out, that's also fine. So don't feel like you have any pressure to have your camera on if you want to turn it off for a second. Hey, Chloe, look, I'm dealing with this. Me and Chloe are dealing with this. We're dealing with the same. They look like, oh, that's your brother. You're looking over there. You see him? We got cats. Yeah. So every culture on Earth has stories and myths about the sun and the stars, including our own modern society. Our current scientific worldview has a story. And the story is called the Big Bang Cosmology. And it was first formulated about 100 years ago by a Frenchman named Jacques Lemaitre. And he theorized that he guessed that sometime in the past, and later science has corroborated it, about 14 billion years ago, there was no time and no space. And if you think you understand that, you misunderstand it. You may understand the words, no time, no space, but you can't understand the reality of it. I mean, imagine something without reference to space or time. Everything you imagine will have some physical component to it or temporal component to it. It's mind-boggling that our scientific story of the universe asks us at the outset to acknowledge that the beginning of creation has no space and no time in it. That's a profound mystery, and it's a real one. I don't care if you think you like, oh yeah, I know that. No, you really don't. Not in the way that to know something. But out of that spaceless, timeless, you can't even say a thing because it's not a thing. It's a nothing. It's not even nothing. It's like what you were before you were born. What were you before you were born? It's like that. Out of this bloomed all of the universe and all of creation and all of the stars. And one of the stars had planets rotating around it. One of them was at a particularly wonderful, perfect spot, ours, and life developed on it. And science, again, doesn't know where life comes from. There's debates about that, but it's not a settled problem. So science doesn't know really where the universe came from, and it doesn't really know where life came from. And those are kind of the two most important things we got here. And so the sun is the source of life on Earth. Without the sun, there could be no life on Earth. And so cultures all over the world tell stories about the stars in the sky and about our particular star, the sun. And with that, maybe I'll tell you a story. Maybe I'll ask Sam to tell you a story. Sam, do you have anything you want to comment on or a story?
I mean, just everything. No, that's a great start. I'd like to, hear what you want to. You can start talking about your story, and then we'll talk about it, and I can tell you what I was thinking about, and we can talk about the important concepts and aspects of it as we go. Or
yeah,
something.
I was thinking a lot about the North Star because we had talked about that before. And the North Star is Polaris, and it's in a constellation called Ursa Major. Is that right?
So Ursa Major, it is in Ursa Minor, but Ursa Major is the constellation you use to find it because it's so hard to find in the sky. You use the Big Dipper to find it. So, but it's essentially
okay.
one big thing. It's like Big Dipper points to it, kind of thing.
Yeah.
It's a constellation you can't really see. The Polaris is almost the only star you can really see, and it's hard.
Yeah. I remember as a kid, Big Dipper was the only constellation I ever learned because it's pretty obvious and it points to the North Star. And then I would hear people talk about Cassiopeia and Pleiades and other stuff, and I just never could figure out what they were talking about. One of the stories, I'll go ahead and start off, and I'll tell you a story. I'm gonna turn my video off for a bit, but I'll go ahead and start out by telling you a story about one of the constellations called the Pleiades. And the story is that it's from the Greek tradition. And in the Greek story, in the beginning, in the scientific story, there's no space and no time, and that blows up into the universe. In the Greek story, in the beginning are four entities, and those are Gaia, Earth. Gaia means Earth. Uranos, heaven. chaos, Tartarus, and Eros, or love. Those are the four primal entities of creation. And Gaia and Uranos make love. Uranos is the heaven and Gaia is the earth, and they have sex. And out of their sex, they procreate beings, all of these beings of life on earth. And one of their children, or a group of their children, are called the Hekatoncheires, which means the 100-handed beings, and they're monsters. And so Uranos fathers these monsters on Gaia Earth, and he hates them. And so he doesn't let them be born. He keeps them stuffed into Gaia's womb. And this is very, very uncomfortable for Gaia. She's got these monsters in her womb and she can't get them out. And so she becomes increasingly angry and frustrated with Uranus. And she asks one of her children, she had other children with Uranus, and a group of them were called the Titans, these children of Gaia and Uranus. And the youngest Titan was named Kronos. And she asked her Titan children, and specifically Kronos, if they could help her with this abusive, oppressive father, Uranos, who was causing so much pain to Gaia because he wouldn't let these monsters be born. And they devise a plan, and Gaia gives Kronos, this Titan son of hers, a sickle, and then instructs him that next time Uranos is mating with me to use the sickle and cut off his, I guess, the whole package, and not just the penis, but the pillars and the stones, the whole thing. And so he does. When Uranos is next time he's mating with his wife, Kronos chops off his father's package, and Uranos goes, ah, and flies up back into the heavens, like really far away, which is where he is now. That's how the sky got so high up there. And the earth is then separated from the heavens, and Kronos becomes the king of the Titans. And he rules during a golden age of peace and justice and I don't know, prosperity and over the planet. And Kronos and his wife Rhea start having their own children. And in a kind of a similar way that happened before, Kronos eats his own children. So Rhea gives birth to who's the first one? I think Hera, maybe, I can't remember. Gives birth to Hera, and Kronos eats Hera. He doesn't want kids. I don't know. He doesn't want to be a dad or something, so he eats his children. And
it's
then
prophesied that he will be overthrown by one of his children.
Yeah, okay, that's right. There's a prophecy that he's going to be overthrown. So out of fear that his children will overthrow him, he eats the children. So he eats Hera, he eats Demeter, Poseidon, just go down the list. And the youngest child, again, is Zeus. And Rhea's pretty done with her husband eating all of her babies. So she decides to trick him, and she wraps a big boulder in swaddling clothes and baby's clothes and gives it to Kronos and said, here's your youngest child, Zeus. And he eats the boulder and is fooled. And then the real Zeus, Rhea takes to a cave on the island of Crete and raises him up there. And Zeus eventually matures and becomes a powerful young deity, and he challenges his father. He actually tricks him and gives him like something to make him vomit, like a something in his wine glass. And when Kronos drinks it, he vomits up all the other children. And so now all of these next generation deities are there, and they're known as the Olympians. And the Olympians then start to battle the previous generation. The Titans were the first generation, and then the Olympians were the second generation, and start to battle each other. So I don't know if this is like millennials battling Gen Xers or Gen Z battling the boomers. I don't know. There's a generational battle going on, and Zeus is leading the younger ones, and he eventually wins. And this is a really important big story in Greek mythology. It's kind of a sort of a creation story for them. And he punishes all the Titans by sending them down into the underworld, into Tartarus. But there was one Titan that was such a fierce fighter against the Olympians that Zeus reserved a special punishment for him. His name was Atlas, and he had fought against the Olympians and was a real difficult fight. And Zeus punished Atlas by making him stand on the western horizon and holding the sky on his shoulders, and to do that for all of eternity. So Atlas's punishment was to bear the burden of the sky forever. Before the battle between the Titans and the Olympians, Atlas had a family and he had kids, and mostly daughters. Atlas had tons and tons and tons of daughters, and many wives also. And one of his wives was a nymph, an Oceanid nymph named Pleione. And with Pleione, Atlas had 7 daughters, and they're known as the Pleiades. And one day, his wife Pleione and their daughters, the Pleiades, met up with the goddess, an Olympian goddess named Artemis. And they liked Artemis, and Artemis liked them. And so they became handmaidens to this goddess Artemis. And they would follow her around. I don't know what handmaidens did. They're like, for, I guess, royal or aristocratic ladies would have like other girls there that would help dress them and do their nails and hair. And I really don't know. That belongs to the female side of things. But I'm told when I go into Ulta, for whatever reason, that there's a lot of product involved, a lot of energy and money spent on this sort of thing that the handmaidens would do for their lady. So they're handmaidens to Artemis, and one day there's a hunter, and he stumbles upon them in the woods, and he sees Pleione and her 7 daughters, and his name is Orion. And he sees Pleione and her 7 daughters, and he just falls massively, overwhelmingly in lust with them. And he starts chasing them, and they don't want anything to do with him, so they start running. And the chase goes on for, I don't know, a year or 7 years or something like that. And finally, Pleione and her daughters are just fed up with being chased by this jackass. They pray out to Zeus to deliver them, and he opens up a path to the sky for them. And they go up into the sky, and Orion is actually able to jump on that path too before it closes and follow them up. And then they become heavenly beings, the Pleiades constellation in the sky, being chased by Orion the hunter in the sky. And this is a constellation that you can see really, because it's close to the equator. You have to think of it. So do I have a ball around here somewhere? Looks like a ball. So anyway, so here's the Earth. And we're on the northern hemisphere. There's also the southern hemisphere. Australia is down here, all the northern things. So the North Pole is up here, right? We're going around the sun, and the stars aren't moving. So the North Pole's up here, and all the southern constellations are down here. So the people on the bottom part of the Earth look at all these other stars down here. The people on the northern part of the Earth look at all the stars up here. So the constellations up here or down here are different. But the ones that are over here, everybody can sort of see. And the Pleiades are over here. So whether you're in the northern hemisphere or the southern ones, everybody's got these stories of this cluster of stars, this Pleiades, and their stories about it throughout all over the world. In fact, somebody in our discussion group had a Pleiades story. Is that person here? It was a Navajo one.
I had one too, but I just posted it a couple minutes ago before we started the Zoom.
Would you mind telling yours, or are you not?
I could talk about it. I'm not sure like how great I'm gonna be at explaining.
Join the club. Me and Sam, we're totally right there with you.
All right. Well, I was looking for a myth that wasn't like one of the traditional big mythology type things you see a lot, and so I wanted to stay away from looking for any Greek myths or looking for any like Norse myths or Egyptian myths, because those are the really big ones that everybody talks about. And so I found a Mayan myth.
Cool.
And so I can't pronounce the names. I'll have to pull up my post.
Oh, you could just say he or she or it or whatever. That's fine. Like there was a god or there was a person.
Oh, okay. Okay, perfect. So in the Mayan culture, there was like a demon god who was known for being really violent and aggressive. But so the myth that I'm talking about is called the 400 Boys. But this god was asked by the boys to help carry a big, long tree that all 400 of them were carrying. And since the god could pick it up with one hand, they got really scared of him and started plotting his death.
Yeah.
And so they tricked him into digging a hole for them. And when he was at the bottom of the hole, they all dropped the tree on them, or on him. But when the tree fell, the god had already known they were trying to kill him, and he just faked his death.
Yeah.
And so he sent pieces of his hair and pieces of his fingernails up with ants so that they thought he was dead. And while the boys were all celebrating, he came back and killed them all, and they became the constellation, or all the stars up there.
They became the Pleiades.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, that's interesting. The Pleiades, I mean, we see 7 stars with our eyes, are visible to us. But if you look at it really closely, there's way more than 7. There's actually tons and tons and tons of them back there. In fact, the Talmud, which is the Jewish reflections on the Hebrew Bible that was compiled in the centuries after Christ, the Talmud says that the Pleiades, they call it, the name for the Pleiades is heaped up, like packed in. So even the scholars of the Talmud, and I think they use it. I think
it's called the Pleiades cluster.
Yeah, exactly.
Like anyway, so it's even the technical term is a cluster.
Yep.
Yeah, I think.
No, you're right. And
so the Jews were right in 600 AD.
Yeah, and the Mayans too, evidently.
And the Mayans as well. 600 AD, they had it down.
There's, I heard a thing about the Pleiades is they would use it to test people's eyesight. They would like we read the chart, A, F, C. They'd take some Indian out there and make them look at the Pleiades and like, how many stars do you see?
Yeah.
And like 2, like, okay, this kid's going blind. No, it's a fascinating constellation. Sam,
I'm glad you started talking about this and Orion and the Pleiades and all that, because I was going to talk about the North Star, and then I came across Taurus, the bull.
Yeah.
And what I realized by looking into it is that it's the bull of heaven in the Epic of Gilgamesh.
Yeah.
And so
I did not know that. That's interesting.
Yeah. So the bull of heaven, when they refer to the bull of heaven in Sumerian texts, which are 2000 BC and before, so the oldest, and all the other ones, there's a constellation referring to Taurus, what we now know is Taurus, the bull of heaven, because it looks like horns, and everyone's been like, yeah, it looks like horns. And since the Greeks got their constellations, a lot of them from the Babylonians got theirs from the Sumerians. The bull of heaven is in the Epic of Gilgamesh, and so I looked into that constellation, and the way you find that constellation, the easiest way is when you look up at the ecliptic or the path of the sun, and you see Orion come up, you take his belt, the 3 stars, and it points to the Pleiades.
Yeah.
And the Pleiades is part of the constellation of Taurus, technically. So it's like the Pleiades, and it's Aldebaran and Alcor, something like that. And so that's kind of how you find the bull. So Orion's not directly involved in the story or anything, but that's how you go and you find it, and they're all up there in the sky in the same place. So it's somewhat connected. But
the bull of heaven, the bull of heaven in the Epic of Gilgamesh. The Epic of Gilgamesh is the oldest, really kind of epic myth in all of human story. Like there aren't.
Yeah,
this is one of the other.
One.
Yeah, this is one of the other advantages of teaching world mythology rather than by culture, is that you can say things about the world because it's all up for study. And there isn't an epic story older than Gilgamesh in the world, not Chinese, not Celtic, not Aztec, not Mayan.
Not that's been discovered or recorded, not that anyone knows of.
Yeah.
And I also just happen to really like it. It's awesome. There's the Bull of Heaven, and it's in the Epic of Gilgamesh. And the interesting thing is, so the story. Could we just tell the story of what happened in Gilgamesh? I don't want to just tell the quick scene.
Yeah, it's hilarious. I love it.
It's a hilarious scene, and there's there's two versions of the scene in the Epic of Gilgamesh. So what happens in the Epic of Gilgamesh? How familiar is everyone? Should I just do a quick rundown of what it is and
assume that nobody knows anything about it?
We haven't talked about it before. Okay, so the Epic of Gilgamesh is a story of like a hero king and his like buddy kind of twin sort of and they go on quests and they do awesome things.
It's a buddy cop movie. It's the oldest story on earth is a buddy cop
movie. I'm sure they'll make a movie out of it or something. And this guy is a king of a city, and Gilgamesh is the king, and Enkidu is his like, Achilles and Patroclus, right? Like the dynamic duo. If it was in Greek, they would be in the dual. They would be spoken of as two parts of one whole. And they went on adventures, one of which was killing Humbaba, the forest guardian dragon of the cypress groves in Lebanon. And when they came back from this adventure, Ishtar Inanna, the goddess of love and war, sort of hits on Gilgamesh, right? Approaches him, and he rejects her very rudely.
She's like, come hither.
Yeah, and he's like, no, I know what happens to people you've been with, and says a whole bunch of mean things to her, and she doesn't like it. And so she goes up to her mom, and she complains to her mom, and then demands the Bull of Heaven to come down to essentially trample and kill them, to pay them back for being rude to her and rejecting her. And so this is important. She complains to her mom, Anute, and her dad, Anu. Okay, and dad says, no, heaven goes down, you're going to destroy everything, and then there's going to be 7 years of famine. 7 years. And she says, no, I have stored up enough grain and fodder for 7 years. And it's like all formulaic. Okay. And then he goes, okay, you may have the Bull of Heaven. And the Bull of Heaven goes down. But instead, Enkidu and Gilgamesh kill the Bull of Heaven kind of easily. One of the things in the end, Ishtar Inanna, the goddess, is mad, and Enkidu throws the thigh of the bull and hits her with it and insults her, and says, if you couldn't run away faster than I could catch you, I'd kill you, and says all this stuff, and she goes off and runs away, and they have this bull, and they easily kill the bull, and what happens is the kings, the gods in a council later on decide that either Gilgamesh or Enkidu must die because of killing the Bull of Heaven. Okay, so that's kind of the story. Yeah. And then Enkidu dies. Enkidu is selected, he dies. And that leads to the second half of the epic, where Gilgamesh seeks the elixir of life, remedy to death.
we don't read that myth in this class, but we do in my Humanities 1 class. And if anybody's interested in that story and in the classical humanities course, we talk about it in there. But that story has always cracked me up because, like, you know, Ishtar is like, or Inanna is like going, she's like to Gilgamesh, she's like, hey baby, and she's like a goddess, right? The goddess of sex.
Right.
He's like, nah, you're like a black widow spider. You consume men and then bite their heads off, and I've been through this rodeo before. Which there are some women out there who will do that to you. And then so she goes shrieking to her father and mother, Gilgamesh said horrible things about me. And so they give her the bull of heaven, and she goes down and they just kill the bull of heaven.
And so that's the story, and the bull of heaven is there. In the Greek version, this is when Zeus turns into a bull and gets Europa to ride him over to Crete. And he's the bull, and that becomes the bull that's in heaven. So that's the Greek version of Taurus, for whatever reason. And Europa is the mother, or is the ancestor of Minos and all of those people, I think.
The Minotaur,
yeah. So, but the interesting thing is this: when I started researching it, it's in the Iliad. When Diomedes fights Ishtar, or fights Aphrodite, it's actually almost the same thing. He insults her, stabs her. She runs off. Now here's the part that I know. This is how you can confirm that it's the same thing. She's rescued by Iris. Iris takes her up and away and drives the chariot away. Iris is the rainbow, and Ishtar's necklace is the rainbow in the Babylonian version. So Ishtar Inanna has the rainbow necklace. Iris rescues right, and then she goes and she complains to her mother, Dione, not Hera, and then Zeus replies, Dion. So it's the same. It takes, so in the Greek, it takes the female version of Zeus's name and just create, which is the same thing as in the Babylonian version. So it's actually like the same thing in Greek. Like if you were to translate the names into Greek, that's what they would be. So it's really interesting how the story of this bull and this constellation and it is a constellation. That's the thing, is when they refer to the bull of heaven, they're referring to a constellation that was part of the Sumerian and Babylonian world of planting and harvesting ceremonies and everything. Anyway.
Yeah, so all of these cultures, so the Sumerian, Babylonian, Gilgamesh, it's like Iraq. That's what you would want to think of more or less in your mind's eye. And go ahead.
So I took a history class last year, ancient history. And so the Sumerians, they're Middle East, right next to Greece. And so a lot of like Greek culture is highly influenced by the Sumerians, which were considered like the first civilization, which would explain why it's the first myth that you hear of, because they're the first people to develop kind of this form of writing or written language as being the first civilization.
And the Greeks absorbed the science and the constellations and the knowledge from the Babylonians almost directly, and as well, and the Egyptians too. So it was like between the Egyptians and the Mesopotamian cultures, you mix those together, you get, and you add grease to it. You add olive oil and then you get grease.
iPhone, what is your name?
Oh, my bad. It's Teresa.
Teresa, thank you. So I'm going to share a screen with you. I want to take this opportunity to step back a little bit and talk about some of the meta issues in the study of mythology. And I'm going to, I just made a few points here to sort of try to get to during this lecture. The first one we'll come back to. I have two basic kinds of myths, oral and written, and that's really important, but we'll talk about that periodically throughout the semester. But it's the second question: how do myths come into existence? And what the story that Sam was saying, and the story that I found, Teresa, is that what it was?
Yeah, I fixed my name. It's Teresa.
Teresa, okay, Teresa. Yeah. And that Teresa was corroborating that. We call that diffusion. And I'm not the kind of person that likes to use big words or fancy words or, give you kind of a challenging vocabulary. I always feel like if you can't explain something in common English, then you don't know what you're talking about. If you have to use words, and, then there could be a problem there. Sometimes these bigger words have they're really important, and they're not really reducible to other words. Diffusion is one of them, and it's not that big of a word. It's like when something diffuses out, right? It spreads. And diffusion is one explanation that scholars have for how myths travel. They're told by word.
With the Greek, I was explaining why the words used for the different gods' names were important is because it shows that it actually diffused.
Yep.
Right, because it's like it shows the links of diffusion. That's why that's the whole point. Yeah.
When Sam was talking about the names of the mother of whether it's Ishtar or Aphrodite and connecting those plus the rainbow, he's making an argument or proving that the story wasn't fabricated coincidentally in two different places. The two places are actually sort of close together, and the story was told and retold, and it diffused. So things can diffuse throughout space. So if I told you a story and then you traveled to Japan and told that same story to someone there, and then they traveled to Kamchatka and retold the story, that's diffusion. It's a story that is spreading out throughout physical geographical space. And that's one way that stories diffuse. But they also diffuse through time. So you tell a story to your kid and then you die, and then he tells it to his kid and then he dies. And so they can diffuse also through time. So through space and time. And so these stories are kind of versions of each other. And most of them are oral, especially in the early history of humanity. And so when you tell a story, everybody tells it in their own way and with their own emphases and with their own words. So certain things change, certain things stay the same, but other things change. So the stories kind of grow and develop as they're transmitted through space and time. And we call that diffusion. And it's an important concept for you to know. And it's one that you'll be assessed on, whether you know it or not.
I'll give an example of diffusion through time if you want, that's direct. So we didn't know about the Epic of Gilgamesh until they rediscovered it. The colonialists dug it up. We didn't know until the 19th century what it was. It disappeared. So the Epic of Gilgamesh is a modern thing. No one knew what it was. But the Iliad and the Odyssey and all of the works and the book of Ecclesiastes in the Hebrew Bible, and all of the other cultural influences and things that came out of that work, we see diffused through time into other stories. And then now that we have the Epic of Gilgamesh, we can go back and look and see how those stories diffused into these other cultural stories, like the Hebrew Bible or the Iliad or the Odyssey or these other things. And go back and find it and you can put the pieces back together like a mystery. Yeah.
And there are countless examples of this. This is a very, very, very common way that stories move through space and time. And it's one of the reasons why it's important is you might think, well, that's just all stories do that. Like that's where myths come from, is somebody tells a story and someone tells it and someone else tells it. But there's an alternative theory, or at least an alternative dimension that is worth paying attention to. And that is, and this is another sort of concept that's a little hard to put into common bite-sized English words. But it arises from the scholarship of people like Carl Jung, who was a very famous psychologist of the 20th century, and Joseph Campbell and many others. And the theory is that the human brain is basically the same in all of us. Whether you're male or female, black or white, whether you live 10,000 years ago or today, whether you're rich or poor, gay or straight, doesn't matter. The brain, the structure of the brain is the same. We all have amygdalas. We all have prefrontal cortexes. The actual physiological structure and workings of the brain is the same for everybody. And we have the same basic instincts. We have instincts to sleep and food and play and sex and fear. We have many of the same endocrinal and hormonal reactions and realities in the brain. And what these produce, according to this theory of psychology, are these sort of archetypes, which means that two people could never really ever talk to each other, but they would still construct many of the same stories completely independently of each other. And there is actually good evidence in the mythological record that this does happen. I don't know if we'll get to any of it today, maybe sometime down the line, but there is evidence that people independently construct stories that are very similar to one another. And we would call that the theory of archetypes. And those are really only two ideas for how stories come into existence and how they're transmitted. One is that they're told and retold and spread. And the other one is they just independently arise within us in our psychological archetypes. And there's truth to, in my opinion, there's truth to both of those.
Right, and they're both working, they're processes that are working at the same time. And it's just sometimes you see just direct borrowings. And sometimes you see hero tales or stories about floods. And it's like, well, that's because there's lots of floods all over. It's not because there was one flood once and then one people told the story, or if there was that, you're going to know that that's that flood because you'll be able to trace it back with scholarship. But there are, like the scary domineering mother is an archetype. You don't, it doesn't matter, like any stock character, the witch, and it doesn't have to be a witch like from the Western culture, a monster, any of these things, a spiritual helper.
Well, and the archetypal, compassionate mother and the archetypal, witch mother. I mean, those are both two different mother archetypes. I'm going to go ahead and put that document in the chat, and we'll come back to it over and over and add to it. These are kind of concepts that I would like you to put in your toolkit for understanding mythology. Another word in there, and I'm not going to spend, you're welcome, Ella. I'm not going to spend any time on this. We've already used this word, but cosmology. That's the story of how the cosmos or the universe comes into existence. And almost all cultures that I know of have some kind of cosmological myth that describes how things got to be the way they are in the universe. But I would like you to learn and remember and know right now, and so you have it going forward for the rest of the semester, that there are basically two ways that myths are generated. And one is by word of mouth and retelling, and the other one is by just spontaneous reactions to circumstances like a flood or like an eclipse or like the sunrise or just anything. And I did not give you today a good example of an archetypal parallel where two cultures independently tell the same story.
Flood stories. Flood stories. Because the Chinese have independent flood stories that really are independent. I mean, you
Yeah.
look at the news, there's flood stories today about Chinese floods. And then the flood stories in India, the flood stories of tsunamis and all these things, these are real flood stories from different cultures, and they have different pasts. It wasn't just one that happened once a long time ago.
And then
So
got retold.
you know, and then now there are examples where there are multiple cultures that are telling the same flood story, and that's the Babylonian.
Well, I was going to say that the Babylonian, Sumerian flood story, and then Noah. I mean,
it's borrowed. Yeah,
that's diffusion.
That's diffusion.
That story was told and retold and passed down through the centuries. The Sumerian story is thousands of years older than the biblical one, and eventually.
But Emperor Yu or whatever was not borrowed from the Babylonians, right? Like he did, like that wasn't. It's not borrowed, right? So but that's the thing. These are processes happening at the same time. You know what I mean? It's like, and so both things are happening. Human nature is human nature. We're all given the same brain. We have the same reactions to the same circumstances generally, right? In evolutionary psychology, they call them evolved mental modules, which is like an app on a cell phone. So it's like
we have preloaded apps in our brain.
That's
a great analogy.
They used to talk about Swiss Army knife, that these modules are like a spoon from a Swiss Army knife is designed for eating, or like a knife is for cutting, right? And that we have these reactions. But an app is better because it's in these circumstances, we have these ways of reacting. Like we have social instincts. We react in similar ways in similar social settings. We react in similar ways individually, like, a lion, that's, if you're scared, fear instincts are the same, but we're human. There is a shared human nature. And from that shared human nature, you can get archetypal stories that come out individually from different places.
And that's why some of these, and we could, we'll come back to these later in the semester, but I think the archetypal example you used of the difficult mother, whether you want to call her a bitch or an overbearing, controlling, manipulative, dangerous. I mean, if you're an infant and mother's mad, that's a scary thing to look at, screaming, yelling a mother, and you're two or whatever. That imprints like an archetype on you. And then so people who have that type of mother experience generate these stories of the mother figure that's dangerous. Somebody who has had a mother figure that's really not like that may not connect with those stories very well, but the ones who do will understand that archetype together. And so when we study the archetypes, we're studying the experience, right? How the apps have been deployed, how they functioned in certain circumstances. I really like that idea a lot, of the brain containing preloaded apps that are the same more or less for all of us. And depending on our circumstances will depend on which ones.
Just like the app gets deployed when you need to navigate, you use your maps app, I mean, it's just like, it's kind of, and we
all have different go-to apps, don't we? I mean, we all have different ones that are kind of our favorites,
and they all want to function the way they want to function. So they don't want to function
right.
They want to function the way they were designed to they were designed to function. The problem is that now the setting is different, and
like, why does my sex app
turned on when they're not supposed to be and stuff, and
why does my sex app always running in the background and use up all my energy?
Have a kid, you'll be all right.
That's interesting. So we need to move off this and talk a little bit about the sun. I was going to ask you, do you have, because I was really interested before when you talked about the Egyptian sun myth.
I like that. I was going to, I really like that one because I was just redoing my Coptic, and it's the same word in Coptic.
Can you retell that?
Egyptian? Yeah. So it's the Egyptian sun god is Re. And the story or a version of the story. There are always many versions in all mythological tales. If it doesn't sound like the version you heard, your version's right too. So Re is the Egyptian sun god, and he was the original king that ruled over everyone and everything, somewhat like the first king in, let's say, like, Zeus is an Olympian, and then we have the Titans, and then you have the original Greek gods. He was in the first generation, and he lived, there was a golden age, but eventually he got old and he declined, and the world went into chaos, and he left the kingdom, the world, to other gods and other people, and he essentially became the sun god. And what he would do, and what I like about it is it's the story about his procession, is the story about how not his origination, but how he rises up in the bark. So it's a boat, a Nile boat, and he comes up and he goes through the sky, and as every hour of the day, there's 12 hours, he personifies a different value of kingship and development of maturity. So you can imagine at noon that he would be in his full vigor, and there's like Ra, the scarab god, Re, and as he gets closer and closer to evening, he becomes an old man, and he's declining. And at evening, in this boat, he descends into the underworld and has to fight all of his enemies and gods and demons, and he fights. You can imagine all of these scary things, and he fights with the help of heroes and stars, which are heroes, right? And he fights these demons, and eventually, he's making his way through the underworld. So the world is a disc. I guess I didn't explain this. I'm sorry. The world is a disc, like a plate. And the sun rises up through a dome, goes over the land, and it goes underneath the underworld. And now the sun is Re is in the underworld, and realizes that he has to fight the chaos snake, the chaos god, Apophis, I believe is the name, but can't do it because this is just the most overwhelming, terrifying beast that it is the beast. It is the primordial serpent.
It's the same chaos, I think, of what was the universe like before it began, or what were you before you were born. It's the chaos of absolute nothingness.
It's the chaos that you spoke of, which is the word chaos, the yawning chasm in Greek. That you were saying Gaia and chaos and all those things. So it's that chaos. Tiamat was the chaos snake in the Babylonian or Sumerian version. But here's the thing: for Re to rise again, and this is what he must do, he has to work with Osiris, the king of the underworld, and with the help of magic and working with Osiris and sort of like the magic of names. So in Egyptian, if you know the true names of things, you can put sort of really like magical protection things and use these words. And he's able to defeat, but not kill the chaos, so the serpent of chaos, but then through the defeating is able to rise again and give life to the world and goes to the stage again, and has to do that every single day.
Doesn't Isis play a huge part in it because she's the only one of the gods who knows his true name?
Right, and so then the mythology of Isis and Osiris and the Nile River come into play. But just when it comes to the sun, I think that's where Osiris gets all of Osiris's cool stuff comes from Isis. That's everything he's got is because of her. Just like every man has behind every powerful man is a good woman. Well, Osiris got everything from Isis basically. But using the same things that Isis has, Osiris works with Re to defeat but not kill the chaos serpent Apophis and then rise again. And that's
also, Also, this is important to keep in mind in general, but also with specific reference to Egyptian mythology. Egyptian mythology spans probably 3,000 or 4,000 years. And it goes through all kinds of different versions and changes and everything else. There is no one Egyptian story about anything.
There's so many different versions of creation and everything. I mean, that version is just, I like that story of the sun. I like the Egyptian sun procession story. I thought it was just a cool way, because there's an Aboriginal, I like to tell that one because that's the Egyptian one. Everyone knows that one, right? It seems very Egyptian. But then there's the Australian Aboriginal story of the procession of the sun. And this is my favorite one I've ever heard. The sun is a sun goddess, and she wakes up every morning, and she gets ready in her camp, and she puts on her red ochre. She paints herself with red ochre, and she gets her torch, and she lights her torch, and she wakes up, and as she gets closer to the horizon, her brilliant red ochre shines and makes everything orange and red as she rises, the aurora. And then she goes out through the sky holding the torch. And that's what you see. You see her holding the torch. That's the sun. And, she gives life and, light and everything to everyone as she goes. And as she goes and proceeds down, the same thing you see the sunset is the red ochre of her going down. And she goes through the underworld. And through the underworld, when she's in the earth, she gives everything life and warmth and sustenance, and the moon is a male moon goddess or moon god, and when they meet, that's a lunar eclipse, or when they meet, like when there's an eclipse, that's when they're mating, and they're copulating, and it's a good thing, and in the Egyptian version, I didn't tell you, when there's a solar eclipse, it's when the Apophis chaos dragon wins. That's the difference of those two stories.
I think that's a difference that is material, right? So in Egypt, they think that when the sun goes down, he has to battle the forces of death and chaos and existentialist angst.
Yeah.
And then when you see him rise, it's like, oh, thank God, he actually won again.
He defeated the chaos dragon, yeah.
Yeah, and in the Australian myth, when she goes down and goes underneath, she just keeps doing everything she does down there to the underworld people. It's such a more warmer, earthier, friendlier, kinder myth, the Aboriginal Australian one.
At least the version that I read, I'm not sure, that's what I read out of that book. There's probably 1,000 different versions.
Well, there are, but there's a lot of commonalities.
Different,
Yeah. The Australian Aborigines are one of the most ancient cultures on the planet, if not the most ancient. And
it's the most ancient continuous culture, because
yeah.
it's a Stone Age. It's been continuous since the Ice Age, right?
Yeah.
So that was 40,000 years ago.
Yep.
So it's been a continuous culture since that. That doesn't mean it had. So it's probably changed, but it is a very what are the words? What are words again? A continuous conservative
it's a very
culture. It's that we can track. We can see sort of like how anthropologists use it, to understand how we maybe once were.
Right. The evidence from the Australian Aborigines can be used in some ways to reconstruct what the human experience was like 40,000 years ago and what the level of material culture and mythology was. And though there is a lot of variety within the Australian Aboriginal traditions, there's something like 100 different languages spoken amongst the Australian tribes. Although there's a lot of different cultures and languages spoken in Australia amongst the Aborigines, there's a lot of commonalities there. You're not going to get this kind of graphic difference between one and the other. And I think it tells us something a little bit about the nature of warfare and conflict in the Middle East and Egypt, to think that every day is born out of struggle and strife and almost a heroic act to just make it to the next day, versus a kind of kindly, motherly sense that every night when the sun dies, or when we die, or when anything dies, nothing really changes.
That's when we get the nourishment. That's when
Yeah,
life is put into the earth and
Yeah.
things become fertile. That's what the myth is she fertilizes the earth when she's in it. Yeah.
I'll tell you another, it's not really a story, it's more of like an anecdote. And then we'll take some questions and then we'll be done. But one of my favorite little anecdotes about the sun comes from Carl Jung. And I love Carl Jung. He's crazy. I don't know if any of you have tried to read Carl Jung before, but he's just absolutely off his rocker. But he's also extremely interesting and I think a good person. But he was traveling to the American Southwest in the 20s or 30s. And he met with a Hopi Indian chief in New Mexico, Arizona, I can't remember. And this chief was teaching him the kind of ancient mythological tradition of the Hopi Indians. And the chief's name was Ochwe Bianu, and Ochwe Bianu was telling Jung that the sun is God. And Jung didn't really understand that. He's like, the sun, you're saying that God made the sun, right? And Ochwe Bianu was like, no, the sun is God. And Jung was like, well, you ever wonder if maybe the sun is just a fiery hot ball of helium in the center of the solar system or whatever? And the elder looked at him and said, the sun is God. He said, what could exist without the sun? Nothing could exist without the sun. Animals could not exist. Plants, people, rivers, nothing could be here if it wasn't for the sun. The sun is God. And that introduced Jung to a really different way of thinking. He's not wrong. He just has a different way of thinking about the word God. Jung had a definition of God where he was a distant creator figure and blah, blah, blah. The Hopi Indian chief did not have a distant abstract idea of God. God was here. God is here. God gives every day, and we receive his blessings every day. The sun is God. It's not at all an atheist point of view. It's not at all a weird point of view. It's just a different one that we're not used to hearing. And the Hopi and other tribes of other Mesoamerican tribes really will say the same thing. Sometimes the sun will be personified as a character, and then they'll tell stories about the character. That happens pretty regularly. But there's also a really strong sense that if there is no sun, there is nothing. And that is correct. I mean, it's correct in terms of our earth or our life. Take away the sun, you have nothing. So everything comes from the sun. And I thought that was a beautiful and very interesting story that stuck with me for years. We'll go ahead and pause and take some questions or comments if you have them. If not, that's fine too. And next week, I think we'll go to the moon and the earth. The earth and the moon will be the subject for next week's discussion. But in terms of the sun and the stars and the universe and the cosmology, do you have any questions or comments about any of the things we've been talking about?
Well, I found it interesting when you were talking about like the similarities between myths across cultures. And I was just thinking about how something similar to the Egyptians thinking that it's the moon and the sun are constantly in conflict is that the Aztec also believed a similar thing with Huitzilopochtli, who is the fifth sun and is our current sun to them, is constantly in conflict and in being chased by his sister, who's like severed head is the moon, and then his 400 brothers and the Tizimime, which are the stars. And they have a very similar thing that if the sun is eaten, then that's the end of the world. And I thought that was how they both two completely different cultures have very similar ideas.
Well, that would not be diffusion, right? That's an important. It's not like the Egyptians were like wandering over to Aztec. Hey, I heard a story. So these are stories that emerge independently, archetypally, right?
Because we're human and we have the same anxieties and the same questions and the same experiences. And so it makes sense that they're going to be different. It's answering the same questions, like the same function or need is being answered by these different stories.
And they also like to keep the sun from dying, is that's where the blood sacrifices come into. And also that's also feeding Sapakli, who is the earth. And so I just found that pretty cool.
Well, and so let me give you something else to think about. One of the similarities between Aztec civilization and Egyptian civilization, even though they're on different sides of the world, is they're both agricultural civilizations where people have private ownership of land and they fight each other for power and influence over farmland and over land. The Australian Aborigines are not, and they didn't fight each other. They weren't at war with each other. They all lived, I mean, there's very little evidence of intertribal conflict in Australia. And they all lived off the land, right? They hunted and they gathered, and they did not really fight each other. And there was no idea of private ownership of land, and there was no agriculture. In that context, which belongs to all of our prehistory, no matter what culture you're in, 40,000 years ago, everybody was a hunter-gatherer. Everybody was like those Australians. The mythology that's generated is much, much more peaceful. It's much kinder and it's much warmer. When agriculture comes about 5,000 years ago, people began fighting with each other over land. And that would be one way to sort of connect the Aztec sense of conflict with the Egyptian sense of conflict and how these are projected on their astral, lunar, and solar deities. And you know that this is, I'm sure, Mia, that the context within which Huitzilopochtli demanded his blood sacrifice was the conquest of other tribes, then taking their land. They would take those prisoners and sacrifice them. It was in the context of conquest. Egypt also had, all kinds of battles, especially on its southern and northeastern borders. But it's possible that the Australians are telling us a deeper story, a more humane story that's more powerfully rooted in the common experience of humanity, and that these other stories arise because of the impact of agriculture and the idea of private property on the human species.
One of the things that you do with the study of stories of like when you look and you go, what are these texts saying? Is you look at what they're saying and you go, oh, that came from this kind of community. And you can define the community almost through their concepts of law and God and is it war? What kind of words do they use? How do they, or is it an egalitarian society? Do you have ward chiefs? Is this a highly organized, complex state with priesthoods and warrior classes? And so you can do that just by reading the text, and you go, oh, well, clearly these are nomads that roam through these pastoral, nomad warlike people who worship sky gods and ride chariots come in, and they just, and this comes from these other people, and this comes from here. And you can almost see what kind of society or culture they have by reading what they write. I mean, that's what you do. You read what they write, and you can see. And it's just really like different levels of development or different kinds of development, archetypes of development. And it's all about context, right? It's all like, it's like we're responding to the contextual cues similarly, we as in human beings, culturally, and it pops up like weirdly the same. Why pyramids? Why pyramids in Egypt and Central America as well? And also worship of the sun god. That's like it. Like that's where conspiracy theorists say, well, yeah, like they are.
Aliens came down around. Yeah.
Like and I don't know, but it's because they are very similar, and I think there are similar circumstances, but way different time frames. Way
it's
different.
it's funny, but the alien thing is attempting to bring a diffusion model into all this. Like,
Yeah.
oh, why are things so similar all over the world? Well, aliens came. That means that the aliens
There was only
diffused
one
the knowledge.
smart guy one time, and then that guy told well the other guys, and that was
Right.
it.
But
Like, that's not a good story.
it's and
It only works with
and
the
it's not,
alphabet.
and it's not a good explanation. You know, like you said, Sam, why pyramids? But because they're and this is one of the contexts where I think Jung's insights are really important, because they're archetypal. Because I don't know, people just do that. It's not, they don't have to teach each other to do it. It's the guy's like, I think I'm going to build one of those, and somebody on the other side of the world that's never heard of it before, I would do that.
You save the pyramid one for the caves and mountains lecture, though. Don't tell them that. Those
Okay.
and catacombs and stuff. That stuff's awesome.
So Mia, that is fantastic. It sounds like you have a good handle on Aztec mythology, and I hope we get to, engage your interest in it, and that you were able to develop it and deepen it through the course of this class, and then teach others about it too.
Well, I kind of just look at a bunch of different mythologies because I've always been interested in it, and so I just kind of look into a bunch of different ones, and that's just one I happen to know about is the Five Sons.
You took the time to learn how to pronounce Huitzilopochtli, so hats off to that. If you take the time to actually figure that stuff out and remember it,
I got lucky because the most of the Aztec myths I know about, I learned from a YouTube channel, and so they did all the work.
Okay.
I just
Yeah. That's one of the advantages of hearing stories.
and like Xiaoxiuclique. It's like you read them and it's like someone just hit all the keys on a computer.
That's so true. Yeah, that's absolutely true. With Aztecs especially, but other cultures like Welsh or whatever, it's like, what? And to some degree, the Ramayana is like that too, like his name's like that. But that's just fantastic. So very good. Does anybody else have questions or comments about the material that we went over? A hard stop will be at 5:30. If we end before then, that's fine. But I will cut things off at 5:30 regardless. But other questions or comments about any of that?
I just want to say that I found it really funny that you mentioned that you brought up like kind of the understanding on why the sun is such an important deity, like the sun gives life, and why it's such an important deity, because I was actually looking through the comments or on the discussion board. I was responding to the discussion board, and I was responding to this one girl, I can't remember her name, but her myth was on pretty much the story Sam was talking about on an Egyptian mythology, Ra or Ray, going over throughout the day in the underworld throughout the night, and the sun god. And in thinking on what I was going to say in response to that, it kind of, once I started thinking about the sun and why it's seen as such an important thing, because I felt stupid once I realized it, but it kind of just dawned on me like what some of the reasons why, like you said, it's seen as such an important figure, because without the sun, there is no life, nothing would survive. So it just kind of hit me, and I felt really dumb thinking about that. Like, why didn't I think of that before? It makes sense. It makes more sense now.
I can tell you that feeling that you have of realizing something and then feeling dumb for not realizing it is one of the most common. I feel that like I know Sam does too.
Yeah.
But it's possible for you to learn to love that feeling. That moment, it's possible for you to look forward to it again. Mm-hmm. So it happens to me to this day all the time, and I don't put too much pressure on myself anymore. Like, whoa, I just learned something obvious. It's possible to get really excited about the obvious.
Yeah, it was just like, it was such a crazy revelation to me at the time.
Yeah.
And it was just because, I started thinking about, how many other cultures and mythologies have a sun deity, and, why is it put to such a high standard? Well, now it kind of makes sense now. And I just find it funny that you brought that up at the very end, because I was just going through that earlier. So.
Well, and here's one of the ways that this material can impact your life, as it always has throughout all of time. When you look at the sun now, you can remember that the sun is the source of all life. You can look at the actual thing and actually feel gratitude and a sense of wonder.
And the sun and the constellations do real things that have kept human beings alive for a long time, besides just literally providing, light. I mean, it actually physically provides life, energy for life. But the constellations are used for planting and seasons and navigation. And what are we doing right now? Looking up in the sky and telling stories about patterns we see, and then other people telling stories, and then other people telling those stories. It's a way of passing cultural knowledge, like song lines, down through the generations. So literally, it's like writing. It's like a script, right? So you look up at the stars, you see a pattern, and then you tell everyone the same stories, and everyone gets to look at the same pattern of stars, and that story keeps going. And so the constellations do important things, and we're telling other people's stories about how they've used the constellations and how they've thought about the sun and why and all those things. So it's real.
And it's possible to have favorites. And I would encourage everyone not to think of when the sun goes down and you go to bed to lay down in bed, to think of all the demons and monsters that you have to conquer in order to make up to the next day. Go farther back. Go back to the Australian Aborigines, and when you sink down into your own sleep and unconscious, try to imagine that as life-giving and
the sun is fertilizing.
It's not a scary chaos. It's the chaos that's the source of all life, all beauty, and it's a very, very wonderful, sacred, special moment. The Australians knew that, and I think all of our ancestors did. Later in time, people made up fantasies about it, but I think the Aborigines have a better story.
Anxious stories from anxious people.
Exactly.
And that's what we see with civilization, right?
I had a quick question. If you have, is it okay to ask it? Do we have the time?
We do, and then after that we'll close up shop. But sure, Ella.
So I'm reading the Ramayana right now, and I'm wondering if there are any like sun myths kind of like baked into it that we should kind of be looking out for.
Surya is, I believe, the Vedic sun god, if I'm not mistaken. I think that the Vedic sun god is named Surya. And the only story that I know of is that Hanuman, how he got his lip split, was he thought the sun was a big mango and he was jumping up in the sky trying to grab hold of it, and got smacked down, and when he fell he split his lip. But I don't think that story is actually in the Ramayana. I can't think of any off the top of my head that's a specific sun myth in that story.
All right, thank you. I just wanted to know if we should like be looking out for those little bits baked into it.
Well, one of the not necessarily, but one of the great values of the Ramayana is it's a hero story. So when we come to the second half of the class and start talking about the journey of the hero, you'll want to draw on the main outlines of the Ramayana a lot, because it's one of the most important, most archetypal, most well-developed, and really wisest hero stories of the human heritage. So don't look for anything in particular in terms of these myths that connect to nature, but do pay attention to Ram's adventure and heroism and development, and the kind of person that he becomes. And that'll be the main thing to take away from it.
Thank you.
Okay, I don't want to keep everybody for too long, and we're right at our time limit. So we'll go ahead and stop recording. And I will stay on